of housing that also included, in this case, the intervention often of governments as a way of getting the conditions of urban life improved for their citizens. In the context of the United States in particular, housing was never really a very important issue. Governments did not necessarily care either at the federal level or at the state level to deal with housing. And even until today, the issue of housing is very contentious, believe it or not. The first time that in the United States we actually had some interest in housing, and again, this is an extremely important part of the history of planning in America, was in 1937. As you may know, the United States and the rest of the world were hit by the Great Depression in 1937, and during that time, in the late 20s and early 30s, many people were unemployed, and were unemployed in a manner where the federal government felt that it needed to intervene. In 1937, the government of the United States established the first Housing Act, and that particular Housing Act was the first attempt by the federal government to address the issues of both unemployment but also housing simultaneously. The way they did that was to engage in and to think about urban renewal in the manner that I talked about, and to some extent even not necessarily in the manner that Sakshi talked about, the city beautification, but rather as how to deal with the slums. And the notion from the start of how to deal with the slums was also coupled with state intervention in terms of what can be built. The key agents of urban renewal, as they emerged in the context of America, which is not necessarily very different than other places in the world, included people like politicians, mayors, elected individuals particularly, real estate industry individuals, developers. Local agencies were often established, and they were given the responsibility of identifying within their cities and within their counties the areas that are so dilapidated that in a sense they required some kind of intervention. The idea was that many of these slum areas, and remember I made a distinction between slum and squatters, so take that into account, that many of these slum areas in fact existed on land that was very valuable, and this land could in fact be recovered, that was the term, and in the process of it being recovered, it can be given to other functions that are much more productive and that will generate income for the city, and that the people displaced, just like I showed you with the case of Robert Moses, can in fact be moved elsewhere. But to move them elsewhere from the profit that will come from the sale of the land then required building something else, and in this case building public housing. The United States had another act, 1949. Remember, when I talk about acts in the American context, an act is something that happens at the federal level. The fact that something happens at the federal level does not necessarily mean that it will happen at the state level. I think in India you have similar situations here, because certain states may resist the federal government and may actually have the capacity to resist it, while others that are dependent on the federal government financially or otherwise cannot. So the two components, if you will, that were established as part of the 1939 and then the 1948 acts were urban renewal and public housing. By the time you get into the 1960s, which is what is called in America the Great Society era of Lyndon Johnson, a society in which the President of the United States declared what he called a war on poverty, and it would have actually been an extremely successful war on poverty had he not also engaged in another war, in this case the entire 1960s consumed America, which is the war in Vietnam. So much of the resources of the federal government, which were initially targeted to go onto the war on poverty and could have completely solved all of the poverty issues in America, were now problems that in a sense were not necessarily solved because much of the money had to go to the rice fields of Vietnam. This also corresponded to the rise in America of the civil rights movement and the voting rights movement. Since the Civil War, the United States was engulfed in this conflict between African Americans, who were still at that time called blacks or Negroes, and whites. And many of these issues, since the Civil War, which occurred in the 1850s, were not fully resolved. As in African Americans, even though they were no longer slaves, over time they were deprived of the right to vote through legislation that occurred at the state and city level, not necessarily at the federal level. And in a sense, they were not necessarily provided with equal rights. They were segregated. They could not go to certain restaurants, they could not go to certain clubs, so on and so forth. That was actually the reality of America less than 60 years ago. I grew up in the American South. I grew up in Oklahoma in the 1960s as a child, you know, a 5-year-old child. And I was the only non-white kid in a school that was completely white. And part of the reason that I was tolerated, if you will, is because I was a foreigner. And I came from Egypt, a land that, you know, for Americans was like, oh, it's worthy of respect. But that respect was not accorded, absolutely, to any of the Hispanics or the blacks of this particular time period. May I ask you guys to close the door after you, please? The people who just entered. So I say that because I think it is extremely important to recognize that the success or failure of public housing in America was very much a product of a lot of these social conditions that existed, which again is something you ought to be able to reflect upon within your own context. In 1966, again during that Great Society era when Lyndon Johnson was president, a Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is like a ministry here in the Indian context, was actually established. And it was elevated to the level of it having a secretary, which means a minister, represented at the level of the cabinet. This was really important because it meant for the first time that the country, as a country, not simply as cities or as states, because you saw that Robert Moses was already building public housing in New York back in 1940s and 1950s and all the way into the 1960s, using federal money, but not necessarily at the federal level. He was using federal money at the state and at the city level. So now this was a commitment to raise the profile of housing. Public housing failed totally in the context of the United States. And actually, so in a sense, I'm just giving you an example here of the notion of urban renewal was that you were going to remove many of these slum areas and you're going to replace these slums with this public housing that was going to be built. Unfortunately, public housing in the United States failed, and failed miserably, and it failed for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons are replicated in other countries around the world, and some of these reasons are the exact opposite for the success of other countries around the world, as in the case of Singapore, as I will show you later. So I want to talk about what I consider to be the programmed failure of public housing as a programmed failure of planning. Again, this is part of the history of planning. The historian who has written beautifully about this is a guy called Kenneth Jackson. And he writes in one of his books that the result is not the intent of the public housing program of the United States was to segregate the races, to concentrate the disadvantages in inner cities, and to reinforce the image of suburbia as a place of refuge for the problems of race, crime, and poverty, end quote. This is a very good statement because basically it tells you that sometimes the predominance of a particular form of habitation, of housing, is so powerful, is so overwhelming that it takes over. The notion that the American dream meant that you have a house in the suburbs in which you have a car and maybe two, in which you have a garage and in which you drive your car into your garage and in which you have a front yard and a backyard and you have neighbors on each side, and it's a detached single-family dwelling unit, was so pervasive and had always existed in America since its establishment, that the notion of living in an apartment in a housing block, regardless of the quality, was still not ingrained in the American ethos. It was so difficult for Americans, in a sense, to accept that. So one of the common explanations of the failure of public housing is that it failed because of its design, something that is very much relevant, if you will, to us. And here I'm actually going to take you through, this is again the Department of Housing and Urban Development, its headquarters in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to take you through one particular project that many of you may have already read about. It's called Pruitt-Igoe. It's a project that was in St. Louis, Missouri, and it was built in the 1950s. One of the arguments that had to do with the failure of public housing, which Jackson actually talks about as the programmed failure of public housing, is that the designers were not sensitive to the needs of the then, what was called the Negro population, which occupied the majority of these public housing sites. This is Pruitt-Igoe 2 weeks actually after it's opened, And it's a beautiful photograph because it actually captures a reality that is not exactly a reality. It shows, you know, blacks and whites together. It shows them playing. It shows the structures in, you know, relatively good shape. It has only been occupied for like 2 or 3 weeks. You know, you had baseball courts, you had basketball courts, you had schools, you had everything. Oscar Newman wrote a book called Defensible Space. His argument was that public housing in America partly failed because the space itself was not defensible. What he meant by defensible is that you could not surveil it. So mothers could not see their kids playing. They were in the 9th or the 10th floor of a structure, and their kids were playing on some other side, and in a sense they couldn't do that. The police or the authorities could not always have an eye on everything that was going on, and hence this allowed for misuse and disuse of many of the spaces itself, resulting in the failure of a project like this one. Design also had an impact indeed. So one of the things, this particular project was actually designed by Yamasaki and Associates, the architects of the World Trade Center as well, the infamous World Trade Center that was brought down during 9/11. So they had designed this idea, interesting architectural idea, called the skip-stop elevator, where they had 10-story structures, and they decided that instead of having a corridor on every level, they have actually a corridor that serves 2 floors, and the elevator will stop in that corridor. The notion was that it would stop in that single corridor because it's almost like taking the sidewalk and putting it up in the sky. So that would encourage interaction, if you will, between the residents. That actually didn't happen. The galleries were not necessarily very inviting. They were minimally designed. They were designed almost in a manner that often architecturally made them look like a jail. In very little time, so the project was actually occupied in the late 50s, and by 1970, it had deteriorated substantially. You're actually looking at a photograph here of it in the 70s. The corridors were in very bad shape. The glass of the corridors was completely broken. And actually critics, as I said, argued that had there been defensible space that was actually taken into account, maybe this would not have happened. So ultimately, of course, the federal government decided it cannot live with a project that was such a failure, even though it had only existed for 15 years. They decided to demolish it. And in fact, this is the first time in demolition, with regard to anything that has to do with the built environment, that they used dynamite. Dynamite was used in wars before and was used to destroy structures after the war that was dilapidated. But this was the first time that it was actually used methodically. In fact, a term was invented that did not exist in the English language. So you would put dynamite in a place and the place would explode. Now, this was actually called implosion. And it was implosion because it became an art, or it became a science, if you will, which is how do you put dynamite at the foundations and in very specific locations. It required structural engineers to do so that when a building collapses, it collapses on itself. This set of images became very famous in the United States. In fact, it was broadcast on all channels. Television was still, relatively new as colored. It was always black and white television in the 60s, but by the early 70s when this happened, it was in fact colored. And as a result, this practice of implosion became really important. What is very interesting here is the project actually had 47 units like that. They only imploded this building, but that's what stuck in the minds of people. The rest was actually demolished with the wrecking ball. Why? Because implosion turned out to be, in this case, quite expensive, and the federal government did not want to spend much time on that altogether. So one of the questions that I think is very important, and it's in the answer to many of the issues that I'm raising right now, exists in one of the articles written by one of my colleagues at Berkeley, who was actually still doing her PhD at that time, Kate Bristol, called The Myth of Pruitt-Igoe. She makes a beautiful argument that, in a sense, we cannot see the failure of public housing as a failure of design. Design may have had a minor component to it, but we have to actually see it as a failure of planning policy. And we have to look at it in the larger context of the history of planning altogether. So she actually talks about, and that, again, that's in the CD that you have. She talks about one of the major problems that actually occurred, and here I'm actually going to show you, this is the World Trade Center designed by the same architect, Minoru Yamasaki, who had designed the Pruitt-Igoe project. And ironically, Pruitt-Igoe, the title of the project itself, was named after Mr. Pruitt and Mr. Igoe, a black man and a white man who had worked in, before in fact the Department of Housing and Urban Development existed, the housing agency of the federal government, and they came up with the idea for the scheme. And they came up with it because at that time the Supreme Court had ruled that segregation in schools and in residential areas is no longer acceptable. It is unconstitutional. So the notion was that the project had to in fact be integrated, and it had to deal with or had to accommodate white people as well as African Americans. Bristol actually argues that Pruitt-Igoe was built in a way that in a sense maximized its architectural distance from the dominant cultural ideal of the single-family home, as I just said. That this was a deliberate policy almost of holding standards down in a manner that created these kinds of conditions. And of course, when you look at it, one of the things that had happened is that you have created a situation in which you have a lot of open space. This was the Corbusian idea, you know. When Kieran talked about, you know, utopias, one of the major utopias was Corbusian's idea of the contemporary city. You put people in towers and you have all of this open green space in between. Fine and dandy if you have people who are actually going to preserve this space. But here you had a case where you created all of this space that is available for use by everybody, but not owned by anybody and not maintained by anybody either. The federal government didn't necessarily have the money to do it altogether. Pruitt-Igoe was in fact 57 acres built on the south side of St. Louis, and in fact very close to what was called the ghetto, as in that was the area in which African Americans lived. You had 2,700 units that were supposed to house 16,000 tenants at densities that are actually higher. So even though they went up higher, the idea was, oh, but there's a lot of open space. But the density was higher than the slum that was next door that was demolished to house those people. One of the very interesting things that actually happened is that the federal government, as a way of being equitable or being just, decided that if you want to live in public housing, you can only live in public housing if your income is below a certain level. So it established a ceiling. And many governments until today do that. You want to get the public service? Okay, you only get it if you're poor. But you're creating an incentive for people, in this case, once you establish that ceiling, to stay poor, or not to exceed that line, or if they exceed that line, to hide their income from you so that they can continue to get this particular service. So actually Bristol argues that aside from the social isolation that existed, aside from the fact that there were aspects of design that were problematic, but they were not necessarily the major issue, you created a structure that did not give incentives to people either to take care of the public spaces because they didn't own them, or one in which they aspired to move out to some other location. Of course, one of the things that also happens during that time, and in fact this is the project after demolition, so this is the project, this is the site of Pruitt-Igoe, that was a photograph that was taken in the late 80s. Until today, in fact, the site is about 75% empty. But you can actually see a few of the structures that survived. So all of the other, you know, towers were there, only 3 were actually left. And in fact, what the city ended up doing is that they, as people moved out, after they demolished them, they kept moving them to these units that stayed there until ultimately they demolished everything. There was also a fiscal disaster that St. Louis actually suffered from, which doomed the project from the start. Yamasaki, as a designer, never wanted to design these high rises. In fact, in his office, he had produced so many models that showed that you can have townhouses, which were only 2-story structures, mid-rises, which were 4-story walk-ups, and a few of these high-rises. But the politicians did not want that. Just like you guys ended up with a BRT that is useless, St. Louis ended up with high-rises that were equally useless, partly because the politicians at that time, possibly like here, felt that to be modern, to be on the map, you have to build these structures. Because, you know, to build 2-story and 4-story structures, that's not going to make it as much, it's not going to be of a great deal of importance, nor is it going to leave, you know, the impression that we have in fact achieved much. So one of the things that actually happened in this case is you ended up with a situation where you had to demolish many of these structures, and in fact these are images of Port Igo before demolition, where it just became a tremendous hotbed for crime and prostitution and many ills. And again, I'll just show you a few of these slides. And again, this is just to show you what it was like when it was first built. A completely different structure than this image. If I were to go back to this, than this image. That's exactly the same site, the same project. But one of the things that happens is that this notion of public housing now, by the 60s and the 70s in the United States, was being replicated everywhere. You're looking at it actually here from New York. It's an identical image to the one that was shown to you in the Robert Moses film. The amount, one of the statistics, for example, that amazes me about you know, this notion is there was a tremendous opposition to public housing in America. Why? Because we're a capitalist country. We're not a social welfare state. What does this mean? You get what you work for. So why should we reward you for being poor? It's a mentality that exists in America until today, absolutely. And Trump epitomizes this, in fact. So from the start, public housing had this very negative connotation, that it's not the responsibility of the government to do so, despite whatever it is that planners were saying and doing about the necessity of addressing that. But one of the statistics that never fails to amaze me is that all of what the United States spent on public housing, all of what it spent on public housing, since public housing started in 1937 until it actually completely disappeared in the late 80s, was less than 1 year of the mortgage deduction exemptions that people who lived in single-family dwelling units in these houses, in the American houses, actually got. What does that mean? It meant that if you actually live in one of these houses, the detached structure with its front yard and backyard, all you had to do is have the 10% that you can put down, then you get a loan from a bank. You get a loan from a bank that covers the rest of the 90%. You have to pay that loan over 30 years. To pay that loan over 30 years meant that you actually have an interest rate, let's say 7% or 10% or 15%, depending on, you know, the market at the time. And you're paying interest on that. So if you took a loan of $100,000, by the time you actually paid it after 30 years, you paid it as $360,000. So there's the $100,000 principal and another $260,000 interest. The bank is benefiting. You are benefiting because you have a house. But you're also actually double benefiting, because not only do you have a house whose value is going to appreciate, but every single penny that you are paying in interest is deducted from your income, in that you don't have to pay taxes on it. Which meant what? That it is better for me to acquire this house, and it is better for me to even pay the bank. The bank is getting the money. That's how the capitalist economy continues to run. And in a sense, I am also paying to the federal government less taxes than I would have if I didn't have this house. So all of the money that was spent on public housing over a period of 45 years was less than 1 year of all of the interest payments that Americans managed to get exempt from and waived from, if you will, in one single year. And I'm using, actually, in this case, 1975 as that base year. So it just tells you what the priorities actually are. Where do planners fit into this? Of course, they fit into in a variety of ways. For me, the question always then becomes, what is the public in public housing? Public housing can usually be compared with welfare policy, if you will, to illustrate how issues of class and race and gender exclusions operate. For example, the New Deal, which happened right again after the collapse of the economy and after the tremendous unemployment that occurred with the Great Depression, the New Deal back in 1937 was concerned primarily with this notion of unemployment. In a sense, with creating social insurance, that if people are unemployed, they should not lose everything that they've ever worked for. So the notion here was, was to create something, as we did in the United States, that we call Social Security. Social Security is that you have a portion of your income, whether you work for the private sector or the public sector, what have you, and I'm sure you have something similar here in India, that is deducted, that goes into a federal purse, and that once you retire, this money is actually available for you as pension, independent of whatever pension that you may be getting from your employer as well. You're getting something from the federal government. But in addition to Social Security, it was established in the 30s, we also established something parallel to it, which is unemployment benefits. Unemployment benefits meant that if the economy goes bad and you suddenly are out of a job, and you had a job, and you can prove that you had a job, and that you were laid off because this firm, this office, this agency no longer has work, that the federal government will actually pay you money, will pay you income during that time until you get another job. And of course, they set limits on it, sometimes 6 months, sometimes 2 years, depending again on the economy. So I'm just saying that because I think it is very important to see some of what we do as planners in the arena of housing in light of larger social welfare policies and not necessarily see it only in light of that. So one of the things that, for example, in the 1937 Act, one of the problems that we have as planners at times is that we have documents that come to us from the federal level or the state level that are riddled with contradictions. So the federal government establishes a program that is meant to house people. Yet at the same time, the language of the program has something like this. That's the language of that same program that established this massive public housing project. Housing should remain a matter of private enterprise and private ownership. It is contrary to the genius of the American people and the ideals they have established that government become landlord to its citizens. Look at the contradiction. So we're going to do that, but at the same time, we don't want to be the landlord. Of course, the people who capitalized on that very well and did a lot of things, if you will, with it, were the Republicans. So since Ronald Reagan came to office in 1980, so that is now what, 27 years? No, 37 years. There has, every 4 years, the Republicans propose to eliminate the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Just like you have someone who comes as a minister of, you know, whatever, you have different ministries, and this person decides, we want to eliminate the Ministry of Defense. That, of course, would never happen in India as long as you have Pakistan, but you know, it's something that grave. So every 4 years, we have this particular debate. Now, one of the things that I want to do here is, so Ronald Reagan managed to bash, when he was president, public housing, and in fact created this thing, the welfare queen. It was a metaphor. He decided that African Americans have benefited so much from the largesse of the federal government, even though they were very poor, but it didn't matter to him. Why? Because they were being housed for free, if you will. And he used the example of one woman who actually had owned an old Cadillac, was getting her Social Security, was living in public housing, and was drunk, and was once documented in the media, and he decided to call her the welfare queen. This was being used as a way, in fact, to attack the notion of the federal government's responsibility towards citizens, particularly in the arena of housing, but also in the arena of social welfare in general. It was very interesting because during that time also, this was the time of a different kind of upheaval in America among intellectuals. So Maya Angelou, the poet and Nobel laureate, created a beautiful poem. I'm going to read a part of it because for me it's also the notion of speaking truth to power. While Reagan was bashing public housing and talking about African Americans, who are in his head still Negroes, even though the term had disappeared, benefiting from something they should not benefit from, Maya Angelou, who later then, when Bill Clinton becomes president, almost 8 years after Reagan, comes in and asks Maya Angelou to be the inaugural speaker at his inauguration. So she writes this. The poem is actually called Mama's Welfare Roll. So she says the following: too fat to whore, too mad to work, searches her dreams and yet she cannot go anywhere. I am here to stay. I will not go away. Now, I actually wanted to make sure that I anchor this in the context of what later happened under Bill Clinton and in fact continued under Barack Obama in sort of these two administrations. Public housing did not completely disappear in the United States. What it did was it took fundamentally different forms with a tremendously reduced budget. Today, we spend on public housing 10% of what we spent during the Great Society era. So 10% of what we spent in 1968, we are actually spending in 2012. Mind you, the value of the dollar has also shrunk. So it's not even 10%, it's actually 5%. The idea was that we are no longer going to put any of our efforts, if you will, into the building of units. In fact, we as a federal government are not going to be landlord, we're not going to be builders, we're not going to be contractors, we're not even going to be involved. We are going to give the money that we have, which is now very little money, to these states and to these cities. They can apply and get money if they want, and if they don't, and many Republican agencies don't, they can apply and get this money, and then they can build whatever with it, on the condition that what they have to build has to look exactly like what exists within certain neighborhoods. Why? Because the phenomena that Kieran talked about, the not in my backyard, was a very important phenomena. Why? Because you have a piece of land, you have a city, and you have poor people who need housing, and you have money that is being provided for the city by the federal government to house those poor people, but you cannot build. Why? Because every group of residents comes together and they say, no, you cannot build here, because this will lower the property values of my house. So this not in my backyard became a very serious issue that confronted public housing advocates. Then there was, in addition to the NIMBY attitude, which is not in my backyard, there was something else called NIM2, which is not in my term of office, in which you actually had now politicians who decided, okay, there's money, you can build public housing, but I don't want to have to deal with that hassle. Let the politician who will come after me deal with it. So in a sense, it became this deferred project, which never gets realized. In some places, ultimately, particularly in a program called Hope 6, Hope 6, which was started under Bill Clinton and unfortunately was again ended by the Trump administration on January 21st, 2017, was a program to house poor people in middle-class neighborhoods within an architecture that fit completely within the context in a way to almost hide the problem. So what you do is you get the people in, but you know the physical appearance of what they occupy does not in any way reflect their poverty or their status. Hope was very successful in achieving partly that. Now, public housing did not necessarily fail everywhere. To the contrary, in fact, it succeeded in many parts of the world. And I'm going to just show you a few of the examples that I think are relevant. Singapore is one of the countries that has the most successful public housing as planning policy anywhere in the world. The very term public housing itself, of course, was always associated with this modernist high-rise structures that were invented as part of the utopia of mid-20th century by the modernist architects Le Corbusier and Gropius and the Bauhaus, so on and so forth. Singapore actually engaged in a massive urban renewal program and built enormous numbers of public housing units, and public housing that was then celebrated everywhere. What I'm going to try to go over here is to just show you how this happens, and what is the historical context or the crucible in which a particular program can be successful. Singapore was actually founded as an entity in 1819 as a trading post, basically by the British or the English East India Company during the expansion of the British mercantile capitalism. And in fact, Singapore would not have existed had it not been for India. So in a sense, there's that specific connection that existed. It became actually an official British colony in 1825. And in 1959, Singapore finally actually gained its independence when the People's Action Party came to power. This was a single party, semi-authoritarian in structure, and in a sense, this very specific structure of that party has relatively remained unchanged since that moment in time. Again, the origin of Singapore is interesting because at one point in time, it was actually part of what is today Malaysia, and it split because of an argument that occurred between Mahathir, who became the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and Lee Kuan Yew, who became the Prime Minister of Singapore. In fact, Singapore was kicked out, if you will, of the Malaysian Union, which is very interesting because when you look at the fate of these countries today, the country that was kicked out is the country that ended up doing very well. During the first half of the 20th century, Singapore also emerged as one of the most dynamic economies in the world. One of, in fact, the 4 Asian tigers at the time, which included Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong, lauded for its miraculous growth despite its unbelievably small size. Even more worthy was that this economic growth has taken place without any increase in income inequality and poverty. And that is the Singapore miracle in this regard. Such was the nature of the so-called Asian miracle. Neither the political stability of the major party nor the economic success of Singapore can be understood, in my opinion, without taking into account the success of its housing sector. And again, this is what makes it important in the histories of planning, if you will. In many ways, housing can be seen as the material basis of the Singaporean economic model and the ideological linchpin of its political structure. Here are some of the key dimensions I think that the Singaporean housing policy was success that I'm going to mention in a second. From the very start, and in fact I should be here, from the very start, the Singaporean state decided to aggressively address that shortage that it had in housing. And during the early years of this housing policy, they started to build these massive flats, which were designed principally to meet basic needs. Many of the early housing that Singapore established in the 1950s and early 60s was very similar to what was being built in the United States. In fact, the standards were even much tighter. What does this mean? That you would actually have a family of 4, but they would be given basically 1 bedroom. Why? Because that's what the state could provide. But from the start, the state had this idea as provisional housing, even though they were high-rise blocks. The Singapore housing policy was, in fact, ambiguously a public housing policy. And there are 2 aspects to this publicness. Remember, I said I'm going to focus on what is public about public housing, and this is the case. So what is public about public housing in the United States is that it's not really public at all. It is about a free market economy that prevented this kind of housing from happening. That's not the case in the context of Singapore. What is public about public housing in Singapore is that there is a centralized planning machinery with an institution that they built, which you actually have a similar organization to it here in India, but it doesn't necessarily work as well, which was called the Housing Development Board, the HDB, which emerged, if you will, as a national landlord. So remember, if the American statement was, we, as a federal government, can never be the landlord of our people, the Singaporean government was the exact opposite. We are going to be the landlord of all of our people. The second aspect of it was that over time, the majority of the country's population would actually be housed in that state housing. In fact, today, 85% of the entire Singaporean population, not including its foreigners, because it has a large number of expatriates, 85% live in what can be called public housing. Yes, of course, they got to own it, but it was constructed by the state with public money. Many of them rented initially before they could actually own. So unlike the US, where federal policy excluded consumers with enough income to obtain housing in the private market, hereby, in fact, Singapore created a system, and the state constantly relaxed the income ceiling and the eligibility rules to allow for maximum participation in the housing domain. So the notion of establishing a ceiling, saying, look, we can only subsidize you if you make less than this much, failed. Failed in the greatest economy of the world, the United States. And here's a budding economy that is only starting, doing the exact opposite, relaxing that ceiling, allowing it to actually quite succeed. Socioeconomic profile of the HDB households tended to, in fact, converge with the national profile rather than forming a less privileged subgroup. So it was not about, oh, I'm just going to address this particular group of people. In Singapore, as in the United States, the building of public housing went hand in hand with urban renewal as well, and with redevelopment of major tracts of land, removing squatter settlements totally, sometimes from important areas that abutted the water. And often to clear the land for public housing, it was necessary to confiscate land that belonged to different people, particularly farmland. These imperatives also were basically faced by other developing countries. But in Singapore, what was different in this situation is that unlike other places, it fully resettled those who were displaced by urban renewal and farmland confiscation and slum demolition. So unlike the United States, where these two policies of urban renewal and the building of public housing were sort of two offsprings of the same policy, they were not equally loved by the federal government that implemented them. They did the urban renewal, but they failed to do the public housing. And it's not necessarily that Singapore even knew that history. It's just that they focused more on this idea of resettlement, and that helped them quite a bit to be able to get that done. Of course, let me add here that because you also exist in a semi-authoritarian context, compensations were not necessarily completely market-driven. But because you had that semi-authoritarianism, you could give people money, move them elsewhere, settle them, whether they liked it or not, they still got settled and they still got something. One of the other aspects too of Singapore, and I think one can see it in different places, is how is it that it looked at public housing as labor policy. So it's not just simply public housing, it's also labor policy. So the first round of housing that were built were basically built to create jobs for people who were going to work. A few years later, in fact, the HDP started building satellite towns and estates in new towns around Singapore. Singapore is an island, which has, you know, Singapore as the city. It's a city-state, if you will. So one of them was a town called Queenstown. These suburban new towns not only provided better amenities and better housing standards, but also provided greater job opportunities. Coupling the two, as many of you tried to do in your exercises yesterday afternoon and even the day before, that was a very important component of their success. In other words, they were sites of employment before they became sites of housing. And not just for industrial employment, but also for people who worked in the informal sector. Now, this was a very interesting component of the Singaporean economy. Today, there's very little in Singapore that is informal. But way back then, in the 1950s and 60s, the Singaporean economy was more than 50% informal. Recognizing that people engage in an informal kind of economic activity does not necessarily, or should not, the Singaporeans argued, dismiss them from or eliminate them from the possibility of fitting within the formal housing sector. A mistake that many countries actually do today. If you're an informal hawker or vendor somewhere, then we are never going to put you in a housing that is provided by the state in which you are actually paying rent, and this rent is formalized and exists within a particular monetary system. The Singaporeans from the start rejected this duality of formality and informality and decided that informal sector workers should be given exactly the same formal spaces and indeed given housing. And I think that that was a very important component of the hawkers. So this is also this notion that public housing within the context of Singapore, even though it's public housing provided by the state, because Singapore is a capitalist economy, it understood that public housing from the start has to be a commodity. What does that mean? It means that if I move into public housing and I've invested in it as a resident, as a state, I should be willing to give up the ownership of this thing to the individuals who occupy it. Why? Because if it is a commodity and they invested their effort and their money into it, then they have something at the end of the day, after 10, 15, 20, 30 years, that they can use to trade. In a sense, it's that very specific investment that the squatters do in their units that we come and sort of take away from them, even though there's a tremendous degree of sweat equity that went into making it. So Singapore from the start actually realized that they can do so, and they basically allowed the individuals to own their units. So they're giving them the units. They said, okay, you could rent, but you could also come in and you would take a mortgage from the state and you would own it. But they put a caveat. They actually said you own it for 99 years. which was also very smart, because they recognize that 99 years is at most 2 generations, so it's not necessarily something that you will even leave to your sons or daughters or offspring as part of inheritance. You can only do that once, but not for a second time. Ultimately, it reverts back to the state, but also because Singaporeans had decided, those who were in charge of the public housing program, that none of these units are ever going to survive 100 years. So at one point in time, they will be demolished anyway. So why give people something that they are supposed to own forever at a time when all they actually own is a piece of the sky, because they do not own the land? So that was, if you will, the other component. So indeed, for example, since 1968, the explicit public housing policy of the state has been to encourage property-owning individuals. In a sense, it's a property-owning democracy, and to ensure home ownership for the people. A key instrument, in fact, of achieving this was the creation of a particular fund, which is the Central Providence Fund, the CPF, which was, just like I explained in the American context, a mandatory social security savings of individual employees, private and public, that is kept in a trust by the government almost as an endowment. So the government can even invest it. But unlike Social Security, which was only in this case about unemployment, this was about housing. This was about, I can always reinvest this in housing. So in fact, since 1968, citizens eligible to buy public housing were permitted to use a portion also of their CPF savings to pay for the down payment and then later for the monthly installment of their flats. So you rent it first, that's the money that you have. For 10 years as you rented, you were paying this CPF. After a while, you discovered that that CPF is now a substantial amount of money. You could actually use it to put a down payment on the unit in which you occupy. And because there's even more money in it, you could use what is in it to pay installments in addition to whatever it is that you were earning. The result, of course, is a fundamental change that resulted. So, for example, in 1967, only 26% of the people lived in public housing flats. 90% of those rented. By 1987, 84% lived in public housing, and 90% of them owned. Look at the transformation. And in a very, very little period of time, from 67 to 86, you transformed a renter population to a predominantly owner population. In the 1970s, this Housing Development Board also went a step further in the commercialization of public housing. They decided, okay, now you own your unit. It was a public housing. It was provided to you as public housing. But you took this loan, and it's not even a loan. You're using your own savings to pay for it. And you've been in it for 10, 15 years or so. So they came up with this rule that if you stay in a unit 5 years, only 5 years, you can actually sell it. You can sell it, and you can even make profit on it as long as you share the profit with us, because we provided you with that opportunity. Remember when I said public housing as a commodity? It's exactly what they did. And that was an extremely successful component of what they did. Why? Because what it did is it allowed for, the families. No family stays the same. They grow. So by doing so, they allowed a young couple that had just gotten married and was living in a one-bedroom unit now to move into a two-bedroom unit using the same kind of procedure. I will sell it, I'll take the money and buy another unit, possibly even in the same building or in a building nearby. They were also so smart that later they even decided that as families were growing, because of Chinese culture, there's this notion of, well, what to do with the elderly parents. So now the couple that got into a unit back in the 1960s now has 3 children, and we're in 2000, and the children are now adults who have their own children. So they created a structure by which the families that used to be there at one point in time, when their kids actually start to acquire the apartments, they can get apartments for their parents. So they allowed for the individuals who had already gotten 2 and 3 bedroom apartments to downgrade to 2 bedrooms and 1 bedroom Why? Because they're elder now. They're elders. And in the process, pocket the money. A complete marketization of public housing that puts the advantage mainly to those who live in it. Of course, you know, one can engage in looking at public housing in Singapore in a variety of different ways. I don't want to romanticize this story whatsoever. It would be fascinating to compare Singapore to some of the other countries that attempted to do so. But I think one of the most important aspects of the example here is that the state, in this case, assumed the universal provision of housing in order to reduce existing inequalities. So the public housing program in Singapore was also meant to be something that addressed the larger social welfare of society. Of course, you have to remember, again, this is happening in the context of an authoritarian state or a semi-authoritarian state, one in which political parties do exist, but they are meaningless. There's one political party that has governed Singapore during that time, and under the will of a very specific dictator who actually was in power for a good 25 years, and whose son actually succeeded him later as prime minister. But the kinds of slums that exist in Singapore back in the 1960s are all gone, completely gone. They don't even exist as remnants of that altogether. And these were some of the things that were built at the time. Now I'm going to make a very quick comparison. I know that I still have another maybe 5 minutes or so, right? Or, yeah. To socialist countries, maybe the Soviet Union, what is today Russia. In the Soviet era, housing along with hot water and heating and local services and telephone and cheap transport were always seen as part of that social wage. It was necessary for places like what was then Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia or Poland or Bulgaria or Romania, the entire Soviet sphere. Now, many of those countries, as you know, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, collapsed as well. But they had a tremendous housing stock, and the inability to deal with that housing stock resulted in many of them simply deciding that they cannot sustain this public housing. They actually benefited from the experience of Singapore, but in a warped way, because they allowed the individuals who lived in these units to buy them. And some of them, of course, in the few years of the 90s, as the Soviet Union and all of Eastern Europe collapsed, could actually afford to do so. But for many, there were a lot of losers. So in fact, those who could not afford to buy their units were displaced. It's a very strange system where, you know, we think of people who were in slums in the United States and were moved into public housing. That public housing failed, and in fact, they ended up going back to slums. Here, in the context of the former Soviet republics and the former states that were under the Soviet influence, you had people who lived in very decent housing for some 30, 40 years. And because of the collapse of the communist system, they had to leave this housing because they could not afford to stay in it anymore, because it was now only being offered for purchase. And they had to move to whatever dilapidated housing existed within the free market, in a sense, moving back to the slums. At the end of the day, what we're really talking about here are issues of subsidy, and we're talking about also issues of political control. Because I think we cannot ignore that in places like that, or in places, for example, like in Singapore, government-sponsored housing also comes with a great deal of social engineering. There are lots of things that you cannot do in Singapore housing. There are certain elevators that you cannot take. It almost depends on your rank. How do you take this elevator? Or everything is completely controlled in the context of these places. So in a sense, you're giving up degrees of freedom only to be able to acquire good quality housing, if you will. These various aspects of political and social control unfortunately make it amply evident that the idea of the public as implemented through public housing in the case of Singapore is both what I would call regulatory and disciplinary. Of course, this fits beautifully in the work of people like Michel Foucault, the philosopher, who talks about that that's exactly what governments actually do. It is also exclusionary. Even in Singapore, with the near universal provision of public housing, not everyone has access to this sort of domestic space. And again, this has to do with the fact that in Singapore, for example, I just told you, you can sell your unit. But Singapore has this weird formula. It's a country that, as you know, is constituted of a predominantly Chinese ethnicity, but with a very substantial number of Malay ethnicity, so Malay Singaporeans, and Indian Singaporeans. In every single block, you had to maintain the proportion of the population in the block. So if the Chinese Singaporeans happen to be 60%, then 60% of the units have to go to those. So if you sell your unit and you happen to be a Malay Singaporean, you have to sell it to a Malay Singaporean so as to maintain that proportion. Otherwise, you stay in it. It remains idle. This is a degree of forced integration, which, by the way, as I told you, Puerto Rico, the United States tried to do it as a result of a Supreme Court ruling, and it failed. In Singapore, as of now, it has not failed whatsoever, but within the public housing projects that I have visited, I have found pockets of ethnicized spaces where you may have 60% Chinese, you may have 20% or so, or 25% Malaysian or Malay Singaporeans, and the rest Indian Singaporeans. They have created within the single unit, the single building block, their own spaces where they still get together and they still speak their languages and they still eat their food. So there is a limit to the kind of integration that government does. Okay, so while this stuff was going on in the United States, and I deliberately have this very specific slide here, which actually shows you 3 locations, or shows you what you see on top left. This is Corbu's idea of the ville contemporaine, the idea of the contemporary city in which you basically pluck down these 20-story structures with massive spaces. What did it create? It actually created Puerto Rico that you see to your right during its demolition. The project that you see below on your left is actually a project designed by the same firm, Minoru Yamasaki and Associates, as a public housing project outside of Tehran, Iran, on the same year that Puerto Rico was being demolished in 1971. One has to ask, when you have all of this land, why do you have to build a 20-story public housing project there? The suburb hasn't even happened yet. Because you want it to be modern. Because you wanted to make sure that you're there and that you are seen. Because you wanted to get a great architect, a very famous architect, even though his project was being demolished in the United States, to build something for you in the context of Iran. But public housing in many of these places has not completely failed. So I'm going to give you 2 examples here as a way of ending this lecture. This comes from Saudi Arabia, from Dammam in the eastern province. Saudis, as you all know, have a lot of money. They really didn't know what to do with this money at one point in time. When you're rich, you can spend it on, as we now know, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia bought a painting by Leonardo da Vinci for $500 million. $500 million, the most expensive painting ever. And it's a painting of Jesus, which is amazing that the Saudis, who are the most conservative people in the world, who are partly anti-Christian, could actually buy Jesus for $500 million. But they did. So Saudi Arabia had a lot of money in the 1980s. That was before the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And they had a minister who had studied in the United States and was appointed as Minister of what is called Urban and Rural Development. And he was given a tremendous budget of some $1 billion. And he decided that the best thing to do is to build housing. So he went about building these kinds of structures. In fact, many of them. He built 10 projects in the 10 largest cities of Saudi Arabia. And each project had 10,000 units. So 10 projects, so that's 100,000 units, capable of what the average size of the Saudi family is 5. So this was capable of accommodating 500,000 people. At a time when the Saudi population in Saudi Arabia at the time was 1.5 million people. Bonanza, amazing, and very good quality structures, 20 stories, so on and so forth. The problem, of course, was they didn't take into account that there's a housing market that exists, and there are people who actually rent units, and these people are connected to the royal family, and they were going to lose quite a bit. Suddenly here the government was going to be the main landlord, so protest among Saudi landlords who were already renting their units to the locals basically prevented these units from actually being used. Saudi Arabia has a very large expatriate population. At that time, it had 4 million expatriates. They could have easily given this housing, which is of very good quality, to the expatriates. But you can't. You cannot use your own money, your own public money that was supposed to go to your people, and then you give it to the Americans and to the Indians and to the Egyptians who are coming from everywhere to supposedly just benefit from our economy and take money back to their countries. So many of these projects actually remained idle. Ironically, it was during the first Gulf War of 1991 that these units found a reason or a purpose. If you recall, Saddam Hussein occupied Kuwait. Suddenly, 1 million Kuwaitis had to leave Kuwait. They did not stay. They left with their cars. They went to Saudi Arabia. And the Kuwaitis are actually a lot more modern than the Saudis. So the Saudis gave them many of these units. And they occupied them at least for the year and a half during this upheaval. The irony is, of course, that the Kuwaitis were very unhappy with them because they were still below their standard, even though it was still the tremendous generosity. One of the reasons that also these particular units had failed had to do more with the fact that they were not considered culturally appropriate. So in fact, the opposition in Saudi Arabia kept saying, so you build these things and now you'd have a single common elevator and men and women would just be together all the time and we will not be able to monitor them and all of the stuff that happens that sort of in a sexist society that wants to segregate women. So there was, supposedly a reason, if you will, not to allow for these units to be occupied. So the Saudi government in the early 80s, by 85, decided, okay, we're not going to build these units anymore. We're going to build smaller units. In the rush to do so, that was one of the projects that they built. I was actually teaching in Saudi Arabia that year. I would never forget it. This was a very interesting project, which was actually left to rot in the desert. In the rush to develop, they commissioned an American designer to come up with a scheme of low-rise public housing, 2 stories. The American designer, that's before the era of the internet, sent the stuff via fax to the British consultant, who then gave it to the Filipino contractor. The problem is there was an issue of the transfer of scale because this was done in inch. They thought it was done in centimeter. After they built this project, they actually discovered that it was about 3/4 of its size. So it's like, they actually built about, something like 29 units or 28 units, something like that. No? So it's like, the door, instead of it like being 2 meters, was only 1 meter and 40, and you just have to go in. I took this photograph and I got arrested taking this photograph because the Saudis' traditional solution was to always build a wall around anything that they don't like and to let it rot in the desert because, there's desertification in Saudi Arabia. So the sand was already starting to cover it. And, my students had told me about the project and I was very curious. So I went to take this photograph and unfortunately I got caught and I spent a day in jail until I was released to do so. But for me, it kept reminding me of, so, maybe 100 years from now, some archaeologist is going to come and discover this fantastic site and then come up with a theory. Maybe the Saudis are really small people because, they had this thing and they wouldn't understand what was it. And so I wrote a paper on this project to make sure that I leave evidence that the Saudis were not really small people, just for the future. I'm going to end this with one of my favorite projects. It's a project that comes from Cairo, Egypt. During the era of socialism in Egypt was part of the larger sphere of the Soviet Union. And in the 1950s and 60s, quite a lot of 4-story walk-ups were actually built. And they were 4 stories because you could not afford an elevator. You could still provide some decent housing, usually 1-bedroom units to the population. So this is actually a picture from the late 60s, early 70s of one of these public housing projects. The same kind of problems that existed in America actually existed in this case in Egypt. You had, but different kinds of problems that were cultural also added. So, here was the case where you have a lot of rural people moving into this housing. And the question was, where am I going to put my chicken? Or where am I going to put my ducks? And one photograph that unfortunately in the rush to come here I could not include in this PowerPoint presentation was a donkey that existed in the balcony of a fourth-floor apartment. So I saw that donkey, and I was, I was baffled. Why is a donkey in a balcony? And on the fourth floor, how did it get there? Did it climb up the stairs? So I went up, and this was more than 20 years ago, and I tried to interview the people. Initially, they were really scared, and they wanted to kick me out because, they thought I'm from the housing authority or something. And then, when they discovered I was an academic, they didn't mind. In fact, they invited me for tea because I'm not threatening. So I asked, and I discovered, the grandfather who comes from this village had just moved to join his family in this 2-bedroom apartment. That's public housing. And his main possession was a donkey. He could not sell it. He wanted to sell it. He could not sell it. So until it's sold, he thought that it actually has to be with him because, it could be stolen. So they actually put a lever on top of the roof, and they elevated the donkey, put the donkey there. They were giving the donkey food and removing his refuse and throwing it out every day until the donkey is actually sold. So these are the kinds of problems that had occurred if in the United States it had to do with no one cares for public space, there was crime, so on and so forth. There were other cultural problems in many of these cases. But what was very interesting is that some of the same problems of lack of maintenance, lack of government supervision over the places, the inability to maintain standards, resulted in a number of things. So this is the same project, exactly the same project, in 1986. And what had happened here is, you can see the guy on the ground floor. He decided that since the government is not really maintaining the space, is not doing anything about it at all, and the apartments are getting dilapidated, he poured some foundations, and he added a room. He just added a room, just like that, in complete violation of the law. Of course, fortunately for the guy upstairs, he now has a nice balcony that he did not plan. It just emerged as a result of this action. So what prevents the guy upstairs, who has this balcony now, from adding another room on top? Of course, the only thing that would prevent it is that the guy downstairs may not have had the kind of foundation that would sustain that. And not just that, the guy downstairs now is unhappy that you are being able to build the room just because I built mine, so you have to pay something to me. So a degree of coordination starts to occur between the residents by which they engage in these kinds of additions. And you can actually see here several additions behind, which happened exactly in the same way. So a group of people who happen to live on top of each other come together, they pool money, almost through a savings program, until they have enough to pour the foundations. And then whoever it is that doesn't necessarily have the money can actually have the structure but cannot use it until he or she or the family save enough money to be able to cover it with walls and put windows. Okay, the traditional response of government, as you know, is send the bulldozer. These are illegitimate interventions on public land that should never be allowed. This actually photograph is from the late 90s of exactly the same project. So what do? So in this case, people had expanded tremendously. So people in one particular neighborhood in Helwan, outside of Cairo, before they decided to expand, knowing that the government was going to send the bulldozer, as it actually has done before, they come to the exact location where the bulldozer is going to come, and they pool their money and they build a little structure and they call it a mosque. Now, once they've done so in a country with rising fundamentalism, you cannot send the bulldozer to remove the mosque. You could actually do that and say, oh, it's public infringements by individual, but the mosque serves everybody. So you build the mosque first, and then you're free to do whatever it is that you want behind. And that's exactly what they actually did. So I'll show you this project. This is the same project, the same elevation of the same project in 2007. And when you look at it, the only part that exists from the old project that is recognizable is actually this part. You can see it even still has the same color as back in the 1960s. What is interesting here is that this could never have happened because one person did it. This happened because the entire apartment block decided to get together to all expand their 2-bedroom units into 3-bedroom units. They must have hired some kind of an architect, although each one of them, of course, decided to use the balcony differently or not to have a balcony altogether. They have different windows. They painted it differently, as if it is a squatter community, if you will. So, of course, a lot of people actually looked at this and were very critical. I was not. In fact, I wrote a paper about that, praising this project instead of condemning it at a time when the government really ultimately was at a loss of not knowing what to do. I praised it from a different perspective, which is if public housing is truly about the public, why should we as planners be upset when the public takes it over? Let it be. And of course, ultimately, that's exactly what happened. The Egyptian government in 2011, during the time of the so-called revolution, also gave up, but they gave up differently than what happened in the countries of the Soviet Union when the communism collapsed. So instead of saying to people, you own the apartments, but you have to pay to be able to own it, the Egyptian government just simply decided, okay, you don't have to pay us rent anymore, we are not going to take care of you anymore, you own these units for free. No, they actually had to pay £1. £1, 18 pounds is $1. So you basically had to pay like 15 cents to own the apartment that you've lived in for the past 45 years and have been paying rent as if, and of course, from the perspective of the Egyptian government, that was also a burden removed. For the residents, it was also another burden removed, which is to worry about the government altogether. What happened as a result of that is that these units were now freed from being government units and became units within the residential market that can be exchanged. So many people, in fact, having lived in these units for 30, 40 years, could now sell them, make money on selling them, and move elsewhere, in this case, ironically, to the suburbs, whose quality was much better. So my final conclusion here is a very simple one, that I think it is very important to recognize that public housing as housing policy tells us quite a lot about the history of planning action, and that it changes fundamentally from location to location, not only based on the policy of a government, not only based on the economic situation, but very much based on the culture of the given locality. Public housing has always had conflicting goals, and some of them were too much to achieve. As planners, I think we never fully understood public housing. And I think until we actually do so, it will become very difficult for us to dismiss it as a viable policy to house people and to create successful urban environments. And this is my lecture for you for today. Okay? Now, I don't know if I don't think we have time for questions, or do we? Okay, absolutely. Which is going to be in the afternoon. Okay. Thank you.